All right. Okay, we're going perplexity mode. So yesterday I published a blog post and a video where I was kind of ranting about my frustrations after I finished reading the Gospels of the difference in the resurrection accounts and the other discrepancies in the text among the Gospels, the contradictions. And I got a message from some people. I got some emails. I'm gonna read one that got commented on my blog from a friend, and I'm gonna just freaking research about the actual accounts, the actual resurrection accounts and eyewitnesses, like how many there were of Jesus's resurrection, because that's what I'm wondering about. Because it says, Jesus appeared to like 500 people or whatever, but I want to know like how many. That's like an account of an account, right? We don't have of all those 500 people. We don't have any accounts from those people, right? It's a one account saying a bunch of people saw it, but not a bunch of people saying they saw it after he died. So I'm gonna look into that, but first let's read this comment. One second, I gotta connect my iPad here. So I don't know what I'm gonna find. My dad sent me a video. He's a Christian. He sent me a video of this guy, detective guy, explaining how differing eyewitness accounts actually make it more reliable, because if they're all exactly the same, they probably collaborated to have the same story if they made it up, which is that's a fair point. But the problem is that if you have four eyewitnesses or whatever, four accounts, and they differ, and you have to figure out what the truth is, that's when it's hard, because it's like, okay, well, did this happen or did that happen? You can't just say, well, they're all different, so it must be true. What is true, right? Because they don't all say the same thing. So that's kind of what's difficult for me. So let's see if I can connect my iPad here. Here we go. Okay. Got it. All right, let's look here. Let's look at some of these comments, and then we'll go on this perplexity thread. I think there's just one big comment here to read. Okay. Here we go. First off, totally understand where you're coming from. Literally been there. So I have a few questions. Do you believe you were created by a creator? Not particularly. Maybe. Maybe I do. If so, do you believe he, she, it cares about their creation? Don't know about that either. Do you believe that if your eternal destiny depended on your relationship with the creator, that the creator would allow you to know how to end up in heaven or whatever it's called? Yes, I do think that that's true. If 1 and 2 are true, then yes, I do think 3 would be true. That would make sense. With all of this, if you truly want truth and you want heaven and you want a relationship with the creator, you would need to go to the source. And first of all, reading the Bible is a great direction, and it's commendable you're starting there. But if you had a love letter from a woman and had a question, wouldn't you call her to ask about it? I recommend you to be alone in silence and cry out with desperation for truth every time you have a question. Go to the creator with your question and a true need for the answer. You don't have to call him by name, but ask him to tell you his name, to reveal himself to you, and in a place of truth seeking, without a doubt, you'll get answers. I say that because I had the same questions and frustrations when I first read the Bible. I had Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons telling me that Jesus was great but not God, and they have been highly trained on reducing the deity of Christ. Bottom line, Jesus was either God or a heretic, and the Jews and Christians are the only two who understand this. He cannot be good and God. He cannot be good and God, which is why he answered the rich man in your last post the way he did. Interesting. I don't get that. Great book about the historical legitimacy of the recorded Gospels, addressing the gospel contradictions, is a case for Christ, written by an atheist, investigative journalist, search for God. Anyway, love your thoughts, love your honesty, and you're not alone. Totally valid questions. Keep searching. And fun fact, there's more historical documentation that Christ came and died, an innocent man, and rose from the dead than we have for the existence of Alexander the Great, yet Alexander is taught in schools as a real person and Christ is not. Interesting. There's a lot to pull apart there. I don't think Christ wasn't a real person. I question him, the rising from the dead, which is what we're going to look at today. And interestingly, on the prayer thing, when I was in Bali, I was alone in a house in a freaking house out in the jungle in Bali for 7 weeks by myself. And that's when I started reading the Bible. And I actually had a family member recommend a similar thing to me and give me this like prayer program thing. And I did it for probably 3 weeks, pray every night, every day, or every night and every morning. And I got really nothing out of it, unfortunately. I was as earnest as I could be. I don't know what exactly I would expect from that, but it didn't do anything. Um, you could maybe say, well, your heart's not in the right place, or like you're not doing it right, or something. I don't know. Maybe apparently I wasn't. If that kind of thing works, I'm not opposed to trying it more. But in my experience, like I grew up religious, so I prayed a lot, and especially when I first started having issues with my faith, I was praying about that stuff a lot because I was like actually Christian. So I don't know. Make of that what you will. But let's look into the resurrection accounts here and see what we got. I already got this perplexity search up. I said, how many eyewitness accounts of Christ are there from after his resurrection? And let's go. The main sources for eyewitness accounts of Christ after his resurrection come from the New Testament writings, which suggests that well over 500 individuals saw Jesus after his crucifixion, according to the early Christian tradition. Most notably, Paul references in 1 Corinthians that Jesus appeared to Peter, the group known as the 12, and more than 500 people at once, James, the brother of Jesus, and all the apostles, and finally Paul puts himself. Main eyewitness groups according to the New Testament. Okay, so this is not what I want. I don't want an account of someone or other people's accounts. I want to know how many first-hand accounts we have. No one from the 500 made it an account themselves. You see? There are 0 direct first-hand written accounts from anyone in the 500 witnesses group or from any outside the observer claiming to have personally seen the resurrection, Jesus, and then composing their own testimony. All of our information comes from second-hand, from a very limited number of sources, mostly within early Christian writings. The only alleged first-hand written testimonies of post-resurrection appearances come from a handful of New Testament authors. So Paul, so that's one. Matthew and John are traditionally described as the disciples who wrote Gospels, so their accounts may be considered firsthand if this traditional authorship is accepted. And Peter refers in his letters to being a witness of the risen Christ, but does not give a narrative gospel. So Mark's gospel is traditionally linked to Peter's preaching, but Mark himself is not named as an eyewitness to resurrection encounters. So I think Mark's gospel is about Paul, I guess, Paul's account. Luke was not himself an eyewitness. His gospel opens by stating he relied on the testimony of others. No member of the 5,000 made any documents. Most historians and scholars generally agree there are no surviving first-hand accounts directly written by eyewitnesses outside the core circle of the early apostles, whose own authorship is sometimes disputed. Okay. So it sounds like there are 4 first-hand accounts. I'm going to say, can you clarify who wrote the first-hand accounts in the New Testament? There's considerable debate among scholars about how many truly first-hand eyewitness written accounts of the resurrection exist in the New Testament. The traditional view claims there are four: Matthew, John, Peter, and Paul. But modern scholarship widely questions whether all of these are direct first-person eyewitness testimonies. Here's the most precise summary based on current scholarship and tradition. Okay, so you got Paul. Paul explicitly claims to have had a post-resurrection experience with Jesus and writes about it in the first person in multiple letters in Corinthians, and this is considered a direct first-hand report. John, the Gospel of John, claims to be written by the disciple who Jesus loved, traditionally understood as John the Apostle. The Gospel claims eyewitness status. Matthew, traditionally attributed to the Apostle Matthew, who is said to have witnessed the resurrection appearances. However, the Gospel itself does not introduce Matthew as its author and does not use the first person. Interesting. Peter is an eyewitness of the resurrection according to his own letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. However, these letters are not narrative resurrection accounts, and their direct authorship by Peter is debated. So Mark and Luke don't claim to be eyewitnesses. Many modern scholars argue that only Paul's letter are the first-hand Many modern scholars argue that only Paul's letters are the first true-hand resurrection testimony, and John's gospel claims eyewitness status, but it's debated. The other gospels are considered second-hand or community tradition. There's thus only one clear first-person resurrection account, Paul. One gospel, John, that claims to be an eyewitness, though debated, and two traditional attributions, Matthew and Peter, not universally accepted as direct first-hand narratives. Why aren't Matthew and Peter accepted? Okay. Anonymity. The Gospel of Matthew is anonymous. It never claims within the text that it was written by Matthew, the disciple. The text heavily borrows nearly all of its content from the Gospel of Mark and other sources like Q, which raises doubts about its coming directly from an eyewitness, as one expect an eyewitness to provide their own unique account rather than repeat secondhand material. Interesting. Yeah. So Matthew is the same as Mark. In a lot of respects, like just copied over. Matthew was likely written decades after Jesus' death, which makes it less likely that the actual disciple authored it, according to most scholars. Lack of internal claims. Nowhere in the Gospels does the writer directly identify as Matthew or claim to be an eyewitness. Scholarly consensus. Most critical scholars today believe that the author was an anonymous Jewish Christian writing with a later community, not the original apostle. Okay, so Matthew is pretty disputed. Peter, disputed authorship. While 1 Peter opens by identifying the author as Peter, many scholars question whether the historical Peter wrote it. The letter is written in a highly literate Greek, which is unexpected for an uneducated Galilean fisherman like Peter, as described in Acts 4:13. Arguments center around the vocabulary, style, church organization described, which reflect a later period than Peter's lifetime. Some scholars believe that the letter was written under Peter's name by a member of a later Christian community, a common ancient practice, rather than by Peter himself. Why would pretending to be Peter be a common ancient practice? It's not how you spell ancient. Sorry, my spelling is horrible. Pretending to be Peter or writing in the name of a famous figure like Peter was a common practice in the ancient world known as, not going to try to say that. Yes, I am. Pseudopigography. Pseudopigography? I don't know. This involved attributing work to a well-known authority, not to deceive maliciously, but to lend credibility, authority, or continuity to the text with a religious or philosophical tradition. That's very sus. This practice was widespread in Jewish, Christian, Greek, and Roman literature. Many ancient texts are now understood to be pseudonymous from both religious and secular traditions. Early Christian communities were focused on preserving what they believed were the authentic teachings of Jesus and apostles. It was seen as a way to strengthen doctrinal or ethical arguments, not typically as an act of forgery. So it was like accepted forgery, is what it sounds like. Many scholars recognize this genre as a normal part of the literary environment at the time. While modern readers might see attributing work to someone else as dishonest, in antiquity it was usually perceived as a way to show respect, continuity, or group identity rather than to commit outright fraud. So that makes it really sketchy. Wow. So let's go back a little bit and let's see. Was the Gospel of John John the Baptist? No, the Gospel of John is not written by John the Baptist. It had never been attributed to him at all. The Gospel of John has traditionally been credited to John the Apostle, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples, sometimes called the beloved disciple, not John the Baptist. Okay. Does John claim to see the resurrected Jesus in his gospel? John records Jesus appearing to the gathered disciples in a locked room after his resurrection. The disciple whom Jesus loved, John, is generally considered present among the group. Jesus tells of Jesus appearing to a group of disciples, including the disciple whom Jesus loved, on the shore of Galilee, sharing a meal with them. So is it like third person? I can't remember. Yeah, it is written in third person. Interesting. In John, it states, the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true, which is often interpreted as a claim of eyewitness testimony, but it's ambiguous since the voice switches to we, possibly indicating someone other than the disciples writing down his account or vouching for his truth. There is a single first person plural statement, and we have seen his glory, suggesting the narrators included themselves as eyewitnesses, but it is not detailed. Interesting. This anonymity and use of third person are stylistic features reflecting the literary and historical conventions of that period, where even eyewitnesses often wrote in the third person. The Gospel's authorship is traditionally attributed to John the Apostle, but the actual writer identifies neither themselves nor the person as a direct participant at every scene. The beloved disciple is presented as witnessing key events, but modern scholars debate whether this was the Apostle John or another follower, or even a later editor using the tradition of eyewitness testimony. In summary, the Gospel of John does not consistently use first-person narrative, and although it contains hints of eyewitness perspective, it mixes third-person storytelling with a few ambiguous authorial claims. If John wrote the Gospel, tradition assumes he was present as an eyewitness, but the writing style leaves room for scholarly debate about the precise relationship between the author and the events. So that's sus. Interesting. Okay, so let's go to the Alexander the Great thing. I've heard that there is more documentation. How do I spell that? I'm like an apostle. I'm illiterate. Jesus' resurrection than for Alexander the Great. Is this true? Lots of typos going on. Sorry about that. The common claim that there is more documentation for Jesus' resurrection than for Alexander the Great is frequently repeated but needs clarification. The nature, quality, and proximity of the sources for each figure are quite different, and scholarly opinion is mixed on how the comparison should be understood. Alexander the Great. Historical accounts of Alexander's life come from 5 major sources. Diodorus, Siculus, Curtius, Raphus, Plutarch, Arrian, and Justin, written between 300 and 500 years after his death. There's also primary archaeological evidence such as coins, inscriptions, and artifacts that confirm Alexander's historical existence apart from written accounts. The New Testament contains multiple documentations, the 4 Gospels and several of Paul's letters written within 20 to 70 years of Jesus' death. Paul's letters, particularly 1 Corinthians 15, explicitly record the resurrection claim within a couple decades of the event. However, almost all textual evidence for Jesus' resurrection is from believers and only within the Christian tradition, and there's no physical or archaeological evidence that directly attests to the resurrection itself, except for maybe the Shroud of Turin. There are a few non-Christian references to Jesus like Tacitus and Josephus, but none that claim to witness the resurrection. Rather, they mention Christian belief in it. The number of documents mentioning Jesus, especially the resurrection claim written relatively soon after the events, is indeed greater than the number of early sources for Alexander's life. However, historical documentation is more than just quantity. Alexander's existence is supported by a variety of types of evidence, including non-literary, while Jesus' resurrection has more, but only within the genre of confessional and evangelical texts. So it's not like historical texts. Claims that Jesus is better documented often refer to the textual proximity. Critics note that the sources are religious in nature, which some view as less objective, and that there are no neutral or contemporary non-Christian attestations of the resurrection. So that's us. Okay, so what I want to know is, how did the people that wrote about Alexander 300 to 500 years later get their info? The main ancient sources for Alexander the Great wrote 300 to 500 years after his death, but the writings were based on earlier accounts, some of which were by people who had direct contact with Alexander or lived shortly after his time. Well, 300 years. Several men close to Alexander, including his generals, such as Ptolemy, Aristobulus, I can't read that, and court historians wrote detailed histories or memoirs about Alexander's campaign and life, although these original writings are all lost. Later authors relied on them as their primary sources. Got it. Use of earlier works, major historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus named and cited these lost sources. For example, okay. Interesting. So there was a lot written about Alexander. It's just been lost, and the writings we do have now are based on those writings that were lost, which is very similar to the Bible, honestly. While we rely on later compilers, their access to earlier records mean we aren't dependent solely on second or third hand traditions, but often on documents much closer to Alexander's time. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, and coinage from Alexander's era independently confirm much about his career and support the broad outlines of the historical writing. I'm going to say this is similar to the Bible, yeah. Both traditions rely on the passing down of information, whether oral or written, across several decades or even centuries before the main surviving histories or gospel texts were composed and compiled. For Jesus, the Gospels are largely anonymous, creations synthesizing oral tradition. Paul's letters are the earliest preserved first-person testimonies, but focus on theological reflection. Alexander's history is backed by material sources such as coins, inscriptions, and archaeology, which is largely lacking for Jesus beyond the textual record. Yeah, so it's kind of like you have no. Let's see. Is it true that there. Is it true that there's no evidence for Jesus's resurrection that isn't biased or from his followers? Yes. Okay. It is accurate to say that the direct documentary evidence for Jesus' resurrection comes from his followers or from within the Christian tradition, and there's no surviving account from a neutral eyewitness outside the observers. Or from a neutral eyewitness or outside observers. The resurrection is only described in Christian sources, the New Testament, Gospels, and Paul's letter. Yeah. There's no neutral or opposing accounts. Ancient historians such as Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger mention early Christianity and the belief in the resurrection, but they do not claim to have seen it, nor do they report an independent investigation or testimony about the event itself. They simply acknowledge that the Christians proclaimed it. There is likewise no archaeological or physical evidence that directly attests to the resurrection. The earliest accounts are textual and theological. This unique situation, where an event is reported by only those within a vested interest or by adherents, is one of the central challenges in using the resurrection as a strictly historical claim. Most historians agree that while there is strong evidence that belief in the resurrection arose rapidly and pervasively among early Christians, all documentation of this event itself is explicitly from self-identified believers. See, so that kind of goes back to my point where, like, if I'm Jesus, I'm gonna make sure if the whole project of salvation and forgiveness and all this hinges on the resurrection, I just think he could have made sure it was gonna get in the history books, right? It wouldn't have been that hard to just pull up to go say what's up to Pilate, go say what's up to whatever historians, like freaking, I don't know what reason there would be for like not doing more to get in the history books, you know? Like he knows what's going to happen. So that's what's kind of sketchy about it to me. Kind of the same thing with I think it's Matthew, where when Jesus dies there's an earthquake and there's like a zombie apocalypse where a bunch of people all rise from the dead and go into the city for like a couple days or a couple weeks. You would think that would be in the history books too. That would be insane. That would probably be recorded. And it's weird that the other gospels just leave that out. Why would you leave that out? And so when I see things like that, I kind of go, okay, someone's making stuff up. Someone, like, you know, it's like not all just legit. It's like someone is making shit up. And so how do you know what all they made up? And I hate to say it too, but it's like the Gospels kind of paint these guys like a little bit of idiots, right? Because it's like they're constantly can't understand what Jesus is saying, and they're constantly being like, we're confused, and you know they're pretty gullible. You know the whole thing about, I think it's Peter denying Jesus before the rooster crows and all this and like that kind of shit. It's like dude was kind of a he was willing to lie. He's clearly willing to lie, right? So for a certain thing. So the fact that he wouldn't lie about the resurrection, but he would lie about knowing Jesus, It's kind of like, well, we know he's a liar. I guess we're not getting any accounts from him anyways, but um I don't know, it's just so much less convincing than you would expect it to be if it was true and if everyone's eternal soul relied on believing it, right? My question, like the central question is like, okay, if God and Jesus like want everyone to go to heaven and believe in him and everything, why such a why is it such a bad effort? Like why is it such a low effort attempt? You know, if you're going to go through all the trouble of creating the world, sending your son to die this excruciating death to um, forgive everyone's sins, you just think that you would do a better job of like letting people know that and making it clear what the situation is, because like if you die for the sins, and this goes back to the salvation video I made yesterday, if you die for everyone's sins, um it's like, and then but there's this requirement of faith, and there's this requirement to get the salvation or to get the gift of eternal life that Jesus died on the cross to give you, then I feel like it doesn't make sense that it's so unclear and so freaking hard to figure out, and so many people don't get it, right? That doesn't make any sense. That only makes sense if it's not true, right? If the thing isn't true, and that's why it's so sketchy, because it was this like contrived thing that someone made up and spread. Um, and that's the thing. It's like evidence that that can happen, right? So it's like, okay, well, how would it spread so much, and how would people believe it if it's not true? You look at, for example, Mormonism, right? How, if that's complete BS, if Joseph Smith and the Singing Stones and him transcribing it, that's all just complete BS. How did it spread so good, right? So things can obviously spread across like crazy across people that have a completely illegitimate origin and are based in lies and deception. If you believe that about Mormonism, which if you're Christian, you probably do. So we know it's possible. So the question becomes, well, why wouldn't that be the case with Jesus and Christianity, especially in a time when people were basically illiterate, completely gullible, everyone believed in magic, um, history is like barely recording shit, you know? Um, like the idea that the zombie apocalypse thing or the zombie resurrection thing in Matthew would happen and there would be no record of it. It's like, what kind of society is it that wouldn't record something like that, or we wouldn't have a record of it? So clearly it's a sketchy time in terms of records, right? Um, so it's just so unconvincing, you know? I'm just like, Um, and for someone like me, it's like, dude, I'm like, if you're God or you're Jesus, right? It's like, I'm the lowest hanging fruit, bro. I'm like, open to a sign. Like, I'm not like trying to, I read the Gospels hoping to freaking see the light. And so it's not like I'm trying to like freaking disprove it. Like, I just want it to make sense. It needs to make sense. I don't want to base my life and believe in some bullshit my whole life, right? Like, that sounds bad. So I want to know it's true. And I just think it's like, dude, I don't know. I just feel like I'm the kind of person that if you're Jesus and you're like, yo, I want to spread my word and I want people to go to heaven and I want you to lead people to heaven and whatever. It's like, dude, I would probably rip it, because, funny enough, back when I was religious, I think I lost my faith when I was about 16ish. And, I had this epiphany because I was like kind of white bed Christian and I was like, just, um, hanging out, being a Christian, not really caring. But then as I got older and I started thinking about it more clearly, I was like, yo, okay, if this is true and heaven and hell's real, I basically have to dedicate my entire life to being an evangelist. Like, that's just all that matters, is like saving people and getting people to go to heaven. And so I have to freaking go full blast at this. And I decided that's what I was going to do. I was like, okay, I mean, that's just a logical that's one thing with a lot of Christians where I'm like, do they really believe this shit? Because if you do, the logical step you would take is radical. You would have a radical life. You would not be a normal person. You would be an extraordinarily brave and brazen, um, evangelist, basically, if you believed that the project is like saving people from eternal hellfire, right? Like if that's the whole reason you're here, is to like further God's kingdom and all this. So I was like, okay, that's pretty serious. Like I gotta rip it. I gotta freaking just dedicate my life to this, and this has to be my focus. And then as I started kind of contemplating how I would do that, I was like, wait, that's literally what led me to losing my faith, because I was like, wait, why do I have to do this? Like, why is it set up that like it's freaking my job to go save everyone when like Jesus and God are like infinitely powerful and can do whatever they want, and they set up this whole system, right? It's like I'm I have to like fix the BS because the plan was ass, right? Like that doesn't make it that, and then that like chink in the armor of my faith is like what eventually just led to me just completely walking away, because that is like an incoherent idea, right? It's like, okay, so I'm like worshiping this God and like following this guy who wants everyone to get saved, but like he's making it the job of like shitty humans to do it, and he came and died for everyone's sins, but he didn't really make it that clear what the deal is, and he just dipped out, and then like now we have to go freaking do this, and it's like didn't give us that kind of a freaking set of evidence to argue it from, and it relies on this weird subjective like experience you might or might not have, and that if you try earnestly to have, in my case, you just don't have at all. um that just, I'm like, dude, that doesn't make any sense. Like I can't, like how I genuinely couldn't go and try to sell that to people, because to me it seemed insane, right? I was like, that, how can I sell that to anyone? Like it just makes no sense. um and so then that kind of just led me away, that whole idea. And I think the people do say it's like the resurrection claim is like the cornerstone. It's like all of it, everything hinges on that, right? If that didn't happen, um and in this message that Summer gave me on Substack, this she says, um what does she say about Jesus, God being a heretic? Yeah, bottom line, Jesus was either God or a heretic. I don't necessarily know if I buy that, because I think Jesus, like, he could have been special in magic, right? It's not like, I just think we could be like, what it seems like to me when I read the Gospels is the modern church and the modern conception of Jesus and God and salvation is like a um wildly misinterpreted and misunderstood message and idea. um Especially when you look at Jesus saying like the kingdom of God is already inside you, right? It's already within you, and he says all these other kind of weird things, and it's like, I just think our conceptualization of heaven and hell and salvation and eternal life and all these things are like off, because the other thing is like you look at the disciples, the entire gospels, and they're constantly confused and getting it wrong, and they don't understand what Jesus is saying. So the idea that like all of a sudden 70 years later, 50 years later, and they're writing these gospel accounts, now they get it right, and they're going to get it right somehow. um like I just wonder too, it's like, why didn't Jesus just freaking write a book while he was like, if I was Jesus, I'd have died on the cross, resurrected, and then made my own freaking Jesus gospel, right? I'd have write my own Jesus gospel. Dude can definitely knows how to write. He's God. He can write. He could have made the perfect account that is freaking, you know, he, like, the crazy thing is, if he would have just put in there something like about science or biology that no one knew at the time, that we wouldn't know for 1,000 years or 2,000 years, and then that text was survived the same way the gospel survived, it would be game over, dude. That would be the biggest religion. Everyone would be on board. It would be case closed, right? And so to me, if you're like, your goal is for people to believe, And the thing is, Jesus purposefully does shit for people to believe. He does miracles and he does things and says, I'm doing this so that you will believe, right? And so that people will see. So if he's willing to do shit in the attempt of getting people to believe and giving people a reason to believe, the idea that he couldn't have done better or done more in a more convincing way, why wouldn't you do that, right? It's just like it's like you're coming to die and go through this horrible death, but you like won't write a freaking paragraph about biology, like about DNA or like about electricity or about physics, right? Like explain the atom, right? Be like, hey, you guys aren't going to get this for thousands of years, but here's how physics works. Like there's a thing called an atom and it has these little electrons that go around or like whatever, right? Something like that, right? It just that's what if it was that, bro, I'd be on board, dog. I think everyone would be on board. But the fact that he didn't do that or anything like that, right? Everything he's saying is like metaphysical and like wooey. It's like he doesn't. There's no hint that he like made. He's the creator, right? That he made the shit and he understands the shit. Um, I don't know. The thing that's interesting is like there's enough about it that um there's enough about it that it's not a nothing burger. Like I still I don't discount the idea that Jesus was maybe like tapped into some shit, right? He was on some shit and um he got some things and he was somehow special, right? Or magic, right? Maybe he did those miracles, like I don't know. But I don't necessarily think that that proves this like religious enterprise we know now as Christianity and like heaven and hell and salvation and like all these things that kind of develop later in the New Testament. I don't know if it doesn't make sense that all the text and all the stuff in the New Testament that happens after Jesus ascends to heaven, like why would it be reliable? Like if the disciples were already ding dongs when Jesus was there. They already didn't understand shit. They already, had their accounts wrong and like contradicting with each other. The idea that there wouldn't be continuation of mistakes, misinterpretations, wrong ideas, getting the wrong picture, not understanding it fully, and then those things take a hold in like a structure of a church and then branch out into a million things. And I think that's partially why you have so many versions of Christianity. And I remember talking to a Jehovah Witness, and the crazy thing is they just go off the Bible too. It's like they don't have an extra Jehovah Witness book. They just read the whole shit completely different and interpret it completely different. And you can argue the validity of those interpretations, but the fact that there's no consensus interpretation really, and that you have like Protestants and Catholics and like Lutherans and like all these different ideas about Jesus and salvation and these different things because it's just so unclear. To me, that's just like, why would that be God's plan? Like that's just a bad plan, right? And I would completely accept it if Jesus didn't make an effort while he was on earth to like try to like he was like that's the thing. There in the gospels there's a clear effort, right? Jesus is making a clear effort towards a goal, right? He has a goal of people being saved and coming to him and having everlasting life and living with the Father and all that. That's like his goal, and he's making clear attempts to further that goal, right? He's making an effort to do that, right? So if you just measure his effectiveness, it's what you would expect from a freaking special dude, special human. It's not what you expect from the creator of the universe who knows everything and knows everyone's heart and knows what's all going to happen and created everything, right? It's like an F performance. It's like the worst performance, that you wouldn't expect that bad of a performance from the creator of the universe if that was his goal, right? If that was his goal and he was clearly making efforts towards that end goal. It's just like, you know, if it's like someone claims to be the strongest man in the world and he can like barely carry some bricks around, and maybe he carries some heavy bricks and stacks them up, but it's like, bro, that's not strongest man in the world type shit, like at all. So that's kind of where I'm at with it, but I got a lot left to read. We'll see. I do appreciate comments like this from Summer. Um, I do. It's funny, like it's a funny interaction I have with Christians about this stuff because generally they're really nice and understanding. So that's cool to see that. I'm freaking jealous about it, honestly. I really just am like, man, that would be sweet to be have a conviction like that, in a direction like that. Um, yeah, the thing she says about, do you believe you were created by a creator? And if so, do you believe he or she cares about their creation? I think it's like a yes and a no, because you can even if God does care about his creation, it's like not that much because of all the bad shit that happens and how many people go to hell, right? Like how much do you care if your whole grand plan is like a bunch of people going to hell? I don't know, right? It's like that's a hard one to think about. But anyways, that's gonna be it for this. I'm gonna do a music day. I've had wanted to get this off my chest. But anyways, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. And I've got a sick Old Testament Bible video coming up. Click the link in the description to go to my Substack if you want to keep up to date with me and my writings and my videos and my life. It's free to subscribe, and you'll get my updates in your inbox each week. Thanks for watching. Peace.